The Cold War, a time of tension, a time of fear, a period that reshaped global politics and influenced generations. But how did it begin? What were the seeds of this prolonged conflict? World War II had just ended. The world was in ruins and nations were rebuilding. The Allies, once united against fascism, were now divided. Their wartime camaraderie had dissolved. The United States, a champion of democracy and capitalism, stood against the Soviet Union, a communist giant, two opposing ideologies. At the heart of this conflict was ideology. Each side believed in the superiority of its system. Capitalism, with its emphasis on individual freedom and free markets, clashed with communism's vision of a classless society and state control. The world watched as these two systems vied for dominance. These two superpowers, each with their own atomic bombs, viewed the other with deep suspicion. The threat of nuclear war loomed large. This mistrust led to the division of Europe. Berlin became the epicenter of this divide. The Iron Curtain, a metaphorical barrier, separated East from West. It was a line that divided ideologies and families. The US and its allies formed NATO, a military alliance, while the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact in response. The world was now split into two armed camps. The stage was set for a global standoff, a standoff that would last for decades and shape the modern world. Berlin, a city divided, became a microcosm of the Cold War. In 1948, Stalin, the Soviet leader, imposed a blockade on West Berlin, attempting to starve it into submission. The US responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive humanitarian effort to supply the city by air. The Berlin blockade showcased the determination of both sides. It also highlighted the risks inherent in the Cold War. The world held its breath, fearing a conflict that could escalate into a nuclear war. Meanwhile, the Cold War spread beyond Europe, affecting other continents. The Cold War was not just a European affair. It reached every corner of the globe. In Asia, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 pitted communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, against South Korea, supported by the United States and its allies. It was a proxy war, a conflict fought between smaller nations, each representing the interests of the superpowers. The conflict in Vietnam followed a similar pattern, with the US supporting South Vietnam against the Communist North, supported by the Soviet Union and China. The Cold War also fueled conflicts in Africa and Latin America, as the superpowers competed for influence in newly independent nations. Section 4, the arms race, a perilous pursuit of power. The Cold War was more than just a battle of ideologies. It was also an arms race. Both sides amassed vast nuclear arsenals, each capable of destroying the other many times over. The fear of nuclear annihilation loomed large. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US mainland. President John F. Kennedy, facing immense pressure, ordered a naval blockade of Cuba. The world watched, terrified, as the two superpowers stood on the edge of a nuclear abyss. After days of tense negotiations, Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, agreed to remove the missiles. In return, the US secretly agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey. Section 5, cracks in the bloc, seeds of dissension. While the superpowers engaged in this dangerous game of chess, cracks began to appear in the Soviet bloc. The unity that once seemed unbreakable started to show signs of strain. People in Eastern Europe, yearning for freedom and self-determination, grew increasingly restless under Soviet control. The oppressive regimes could no longer suppress the growing discontent. In 1956, Hungarians rose up against their Soviet-imposed government. This was a bold and desperate attempt to reclaim their sovereignty. The uprising was brutally crushed by Soviet tanks, a stark reminder of the Kremlin's willingness to use force to maintain its grip on power. The devastation left a lasting scar on the Hungarian psyche. Despite the crackdown, the desire for freedom continued to simmer behind the Iron Curtain. The spirit of resistance could not be entirely extinguished. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Prague Spring brought a period of liberalization and reform. It was a brief moment of hope and change. However, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies invaded, crushing the reform movement and installing a hardline communist government. The dream of a more open society was shattered. These events, while tragic, revealed the growing internal contradictions within the Soviet Empire. The seeds of dissension had been sown, and the cracks in the bloc were becoming impossible to ignore. Section 6. Tearing down the wall. The collapse of communism. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union, bogged down in an unwinnable war in Afghanistan and facing a stagnant economy, was beginning to crumble from within. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the Soviet leader in 1985, introduced reforms like glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring, in an attempt to salvage the Soviet system. However, these reforms, intended to revitalize the Soviet Union, inadvertently hastened its demise. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, a potent symbol of Cold War division, fell. One by one, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, marking the end of the Cold War. The world, once held captive by the fear of nuclear annihilation, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Section 7. The Cold War's shadow, a lasting legacy. The Cold War may be over, but its legacy continues to shape the world we live in, influencing political, social, and economic landscapes across the globe. NATO, the military alliance formed to counter the Soviet threat, still exists today, adapting to new challenges and threats in a constantly changing world. The United Nations, established in the aftermath of World War II to promote international cooperation, continues to grapple with the challenges of a multipolar world, striving to maintain peace and security. The ideological struggle between democracy and authoritarianism persists, manifesting in various forms around the world. The rivalry between the United States and Russia, while not as intense as during the Cold War, continues to influence global politics, affecting international relations and alliances. The Cold War may be a historical event, but its lessons remain relevant, reminding us of the complexities of global power dynamics. It taught us the importance of diplomacy, negotiation, and the need for peaceful resolutions to conflicts. The dangers of nuclear proliferation, highlighting the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, and the enduring human desire for freedom and self-determination, which continues to inspire movements for change. As we navigate the complexities of the 21st century, we would do well to remember the lessons of that era, applying them to build a more peaceful and just world.